I think we're live. Let's just see. Let's see if the comments say we're live. Hopefully we are live. It's telling us, the StreamYard is telling me that we're live. Can you guys hear me? Can you do you hear me fine? Let's wait. Awesome. I see some pluses in the chat. Yeah, let's wait a minute for people to join. Awesome. I can see. Yeah. Okay. All right. So hello everyone. Let me introduce myself. My name is Nikola, and I'm a senior software engineer at EPAM, and I'm part of a JavaScript community for the Balkans. And today we'll talk a little bit about React components, and I have a little talk and presentation for it. So I want to preface by saying that we'll talk about React components, what they are, why they're useful, and I think the important thing is to there's a lot of things to talk about, and we won't discuss everything here because you can talk about it forever. But I'll try to have to show you guys what is the idea behind them, and why use them and how they're used, and have some examples. But you can I'll have some links later to show you guys where to start and where to see more if you're interested in that. So yeah, I see. Yeah, you see we have an Instagram, so please follow our Instagram account for the Balkans. So I think people join now. So let me open the presentation. Can you guys see the presentation? Hopefully you see it. All right, so let's start with the presentation. So yeah, as I said, Nikola, senior software engineer. I'm here based in Serbia, Novi Sad, and yeah, so that's me. And we have a small agenda to see what we're going to talk about today, and we have some points here which we'll go over. But the crux of the talk is React server components, and they've been out for a while. I think 2020 is when they were first introduced, and it's an interesting position for React and React server components, because they're not fully fully stable, but there are a lot of people using them. So we'll go over and see where they are currently. So let's go with the first slide. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is multi-page application and single-page applications. I just wanted to remind people what they are, because they're important for React server components. So really, we have these two different ways of creating, let's say, creating applications and creating websites, which is a multi-page application and a single-page application. So in multi-page applications, these are things like Ruby on Rails, Django, Laravel, PHP. So MVC, basically MVC structure. We have our app that consists of multiple HTML pages, and each page renders HTML on the server, and then the server sends it to the client, to the browser, basically, to be rendered. And when we have a multi-page application, each navigation through your browser, so when you're changing pages, you're basically getting a new HTML document each time, which results in a not so interactive website. And one of the things that we do when we do a multi-page application is we lose state between navigations. So if you had any state, any user input when you change pages, because it gets a new HTML document, you lose the state. And this was basically the way to go about creating websites like 10, 15 years ago. And then React and some other frameworks introduced a single page applications, which basically handle all the routing and everything on the client by injecting HTML with JavaScript. So the way the single page application would work, they would consist of single JavaScript application that loads into the browser, and then the browser renders the HTML locally, and basically navigation is done also locally. It ejects the normal browser routing and makes it so that it's like a local thing, and that you can preserve state between changing pages, because it's all like a single page. Like that's the name where it comes from. It's more responsive than multi-page applications. That's why we started to use them. We wanted to feel like that our websites are like a native apps that you would have on your computer, on your phone. They will be much more interactive, and you can like you have all the buttons that you don't need to change pages when doing some action. So I just wanted to remind you guys about these two things, these two concepts, and we'll see where React Server components come into here. So let's go to the next slide. So what are server components? So I have a little in a nutshell here, and we'll go over with the actual examples. This is just a like small description of them. So in a way, they are an architecture. They are a way of rendering and orchestrating applications. They require a little bit of rethinking of the React and how we structure things, how we create files, how we create directories and stuff. And really, they're a way to create async components on the server. So until now, all of your React components were always synchronous, and you would need to have your lifecycle hooks like useEffect and stuff to actually do anything async. So React Server components are really a way to have async React components, and you'll see what that means later. So a good thing is that they can include server at every level of virtual DOM, and we can have a server components, and then we can have client components, and then we can again have server components in our tree DOM. So they kind of blur the line between the client and the server. So you'll see like sometimes you're not even able to see, like you're not sure if you're on the client or on the server. So they really kind of blur the lines between those two, and they are more of like a full stack application. You can think of it that way, where you have your server and client, and they're all like in the one technology, like in one stack. So some of the benefits that it unlocks are for data fetching, performance, and UX. You'll see why that is, why it increased data fetching and performance, like speed of data fetching and performance. And yeah, they're still experimental, but currently there's a stable implementation with the Next.js 13 app directory. And we'll see how Next basically implemented them. So where do they fit with the single page or multi-page? Well, they're kind of a hybrid approach. So we do have our components that are rendered on the server, and we have routing on the server, like in multi-page applications, but we also have client components that are hydrated on the client, and we have also navigation on the client. So it's kind of hybrid approach, and good thing about it is that we can have a server routing and server components, but also preserve state between navigation, and there's when something is changed, we don't have to do a hard refresh. Like it seamlessly merged into our DOM. So we'll see how that looks like. So let's go. So this is image from Next.js documentation, and I think it explains nicely like how it looks on the actual page. So you can see that we have a navbar, a sidebar, and some main content that you'll have, and you can see that these components that are purple, they are basically server components, and then we have the blue ones are client ones. And you can see that the difference between those two. So for example, Nowbar, the things that are static, that don't change much, that can be fetched on the server are in the navbar, for example, your user profile or your username, whatever. And then we have the search, which requires user input, that is a client component. So let's see how we can. So I created a little bit example how this looks in the code in the Next.js implementation. So we go to the Next.js implementation, and first thing to talk about here is the app directory. So you'll see that people mention this Next.js app directory, and what it means is basically that anything you create inside your app directory, that will be using React Server components in the Next.js. So for example, here we have the app directory, and then we have the page file and layout file, head, and some CSS. And I really want to focus on the page and the layout. So the layout is like your if people are familiar with Laravel and PHP, you have your blade templates, and then you have layouts, which basically say, okay, so this is something that we'll have on every page, and that will be our layout. So example, stuff like navbar and footer can be in the layout if they're on every page, and then the actual page is the actual content of that page. So we can have multiple layouts, and they can basically nest. We can have nested layouts in our next step, and then the page is the actual content of that page. So let me show you what I mean. So if I go to the next slide, so we have the page here, which is, let's say, our home page, and what we're doing, we're basically returning a navbar, a sidebar. We didn't put it in the layout here, but for example, navbar can be put in the layout if it's on every page. So we have our navbar sidebar, and we have some main content there. So there's nothing special about this. You probably all seen this before. So if we go to the navbar implementation, so this is maybe the way you would do it in your client app. So with create next step, for example, you would let's say that you want to write out the user's name when he opens the site in the navbar. So this would be a way like for you to do it on the client. So you would have some state, right? And then we have maybe a use effect that will fetch the user, the current user, and then set it there, and then render the user. So if we try to do this in the next app, like in the next app directory, you will get something like this. So it will basically tell you that you cannot use effect, you can't use effect inside the server components, and that's the first important thing to know about server components, is they don't allow for lifecycle methods or lifecycle functions. So you would get something like this, an error. So how do we change this into, like, how do we actually use the React Server component? Well, we would change it to be an async function. So you can see the word async there. And we would basically fetch the user directly in the first line of the function. We would await for the user, and then we would render it. So if you're familiar with React, you could not do this because you could not await, like, top level await before rendering a component. So this is a really nice way to use a React Server component, is to, like, maybe you have some fetching you need to do or some static content that won't change. So you load it once, and then that will be rendered on the client. So for example, if you wanted to add a search next, like have navbar and have a search, we can. And so I've added the search here, and let me show you how it looks like. So this is the search component. Like, it has an input and it has a state and some handler to handle the change of the search. It does not call any API currently, but like, this is the usual way that you would implement the search component. And so let's see what happens if we try that. So we will get another error that says that you cannot also use state. And why is that? Because as you know, the navbar is a server component, and search is also server component by default. So this is an important thing to know about Next.js app directory, that all components would be server default. So any component that you create are server components by default. It doesn't matter if you put async or not; they're still like treated as a server component. And so how do we actually transform this into a client component? Well, Next.js added a directive that you can put on top of the file, which is use client. So when we mark the file with use client, we basically tell Next.js that, okay, so this is a client component and it should never be run on the server. And Next.js will just ignore that file when doing the initial render, doing the initial server render. It will ignore this file. And that way, we basically mark this component as a use client. Now, some people tell like this looks like a bad code. You know, it doesn't look like something it should be done this way. But this is how Next implemented. Basically, they were inspired by use strict in the that we have like now in React. Okay, so then after that we have our sidebar. So we handle the navbar. Now we have the sidebar, and the sidebar has some static links that we render, and we don't have any fetching or anything. And we also render the current date. So we just current date and time we want to render in our sidebar, for example. And let me show you the current date. So this is just a component that creates a new date and turns it into a string. And you can see that we also used use client here. And that is because we want always to show the date of the user, and his time zone. Because if you were to run this on the server, if you didn't have use client here, it will only show you the server time. So it will create the date on the server and it will show you the server time. So it would be the same. If it's one server, it would be the same for all users. So that's why we mark it as use client, and basically to write out the client's time. And so I have a little animation of how this works. So here you can see on the left we have the server and we have the components. And so first the navbar is the main the home page is rendered, and then we have a parallel. So the way it works, Next tries to render these things that it can in parallel on the server, so it runs faster. So you can see that is being rendered, and then it is being sent to the client. And you would think that it would send HTML to the client, but this is not true. It actually sends JSON file to the client, which is a JSON of JSX, of serialized JSX. Now there's a lot to talk about here. Why do they do that, and why do they don't send HTML? But I'll leave that for later. So it sends the JSON, and then it gets rendered in the client. So you can see these purple components are your server components, and then you have this, let's say, holes, or these things where the client's component go in, and so they get rendered and they get hydrated. So they download the JS bundle that they need, and they get hydrated, and then they're interactive, and then we finally have a full React application. And so some people call these like islands of interactivity, because you can think about it, the server components like your skeleton for your app. So you have the things that are static and that maybe need fetching a user once, and once on load, and that's it. And so you would have this skeleton of your server components, and then you have these small like islands of interactivity, where there are client components where user can actually input stuff, click on buttons, and like do whatever, like fill out forms and stuff like that. And this is, so the reason for this is because you cannot attach any handlers on the server, and you also can't use state on the server. So that's why we use client components there, where the user actually interacts with our app. And so really the goal with server components is to have as much as server components you can deep into your DOM tree. So you want to leave out client components for your leaves at the end of the tree, and have it have as much as server components rendered on the server. So that's kind of the goal, the main goal of React Server Components, and we'll see why that is a little bit later. And Okay, so I want to go a little bit more into data fetching and rendering. So this was just an example. Have another here, and so the good thing about the app is it works same as the Pages folder. If you use Next.js, you know what Pages folder is. So the app works in a similar way. So if you create, for example, in your app directory, if you create a folder like dashboard folder and then a settings folder, it will basically create a route /dashboard// settings. And that's good because it handles the routing by basically by folders. Now, some people like this, some people don't, but I think it's good because it's clear and it's easy to use. So in this case, we'll create a blog folder which will have a page. Page is like an entry to your like /blog. So what next will do, it will create a /blog here, and it will basically render this page. And now you can see how you can nest your layouts. So you can have blog, and then blog can also have a layout file. And so it would first use the layout from the root of app, and then it would use the layout from the blog. And layout is basically just a component that like wraps your page, that wraps around your page. So yeah, let's create a blog, and here's the function, and you can see that it's async. And so what's really interesting that we can actually use, so we can use our database now because we're on the server, right? So we can use our database directly inside our components, and you can see like we're fetching a user. You can imagine that you would like you wouldn't hard code this, but it's hard coded here. But you would maybe use cookies to get the user session or something to get the current user, and then we get his posts using that user ID. And then what we do is just render the name of the user and render the posts. So if we go into the post function, you can also see that the post is also actually async. And what we're actually doing is fetching the comments for each post. So we could have put comments, so we could have fetched comments here and like merge them with posts. So every post has a list of comments, but we're not actually doing that. We're actually, for each post that is rendered, it will call comments to find comment for that post. So the thing that I want to just say here is that you need to be careful with fetching too many stuff here. So if you, for example, fetched comments here and fetched something else, it could create a kind of waterfall effect that your blog would basically wait for all these fetches to be finished and this database access to be finished to render your component, and that can cause a slow initial load time. So you just need to be careful about this. So yeah, in the post is also async, and we also fetch the comments here. And what we do is just render out the comments. And yeah, that's it. And so you can think if we wanted to add maybe a button here to basically like the comment or whatever, so we can add a button. But you have to remember that we can't attach handlers or anything to buttons in the server component. So that's the issue here. So we could not actually do it like this. Like this would work, but it would not allow you to attach any handlers to it. So what we have to do is to basically take this JSX here and put it in another file in its own component. So we created a comment component, and we said use client. So now Next will know that, okay, this is a client component, so you can actually attach on-click handler here. And so basically what we do is we get the ID and the content, we display the content, and then we put the handle like, which posts the like for that comment. So you can see here that you kind of need to, when you're working with React server points, you kind of need to think about a little bit differently about React. And it will force you to create smaller components and like to have more of them and create all the files for all the components. So you could not, for example, you could not create a component here inside the post file, you know, like below the post function. You cannot create it because in order to say use client, you need to have entire file. So you really need to think about that when you're creating like, okay, I'll need client here, so I have to put this into another file, create a separate component, and say use client, so next will know. So yeah, so we just use it here now, and that will work because this is a server component that renders a list of client components. And so we have another animation to see how this looks like. So we have the blog page, which is rendered, and then we have all the posts that are rendered. And then for each post, we're also fetching the comments. So we're loading the comments. And then we're sending this as a JSON to the client. Client renders it. You can see this is, again, like a skeleton. And then you have your little like interactive parts inside them as client components. So they're hydrated on the client. Their JS bundle is downloaded, and they start to be like interactive. And then you have your normal React app. So for people that for some people that this might be like nothing new because we already had this similar. It was not like this, but it was similar in PHP like 20 years ago. We had something like that where you would have some part of your HTML have like PHP run on the server, and then it would all get rendered on the server and sent as a HTML. But you can basically choose, okay, this is server, then this button will be not like we will not have anything with PHP. It would just be a normal button. So it's kind of similar in that way. If people did PHP, they would, I think, find this easier to understand. But the thing about PHP, it was a multi-page application only, so it did not have hydration on the client. It did not have navigation on the client. It could not be interactive as a React. So I want to talk a little bit about SSR, how it fits here, because people can confuse these two concepts. So is this the same thing as SSR? Well, it's not. It only has server, and I think that's the only like server in the name. So the SSR works by pre-rendering the entire page with HTML, and you can use lifecycle and state, and then it sends that to the client, after which the client use hydration, which is basically, okay, let me download the JS bundle and make this like go through the DOM and attach all the handlers, so the page becomes interactive. All data fetching and hooks are also ran on the client. So the main idea about SSR is to increase the initial load of the page, but then it handles everything to the client. So this is a important distinction between these two, because React Server components run only on the server and do everything on the server, and they do not require client at all. They just render on the client. I mean, the client only shows them rendered. So yeah, I think yeah. And one more thing is SSR does not support async components. So this is important distinction. But a good thing is that you can basically use the combination of these two. So you can use React Server components and you can use SSR for your client components. So you'll actually see them be used as a combination in Next. All right. So yeah. So let's discuss about the good things and what are the bad things, like pros and cons. So what is good about it? So we have a few things. First is the automatic code splitting and co-location of the data fetching. Basically, you can have every component fetch the data they need. And so you don't have to, for example, on the client, you always have to maybe lift the state. You know, if you have two siblings of the components, you have to lift the state up in the parent component, fetch it there, and then give it props. So this is not the case for server components, because you can fetch for each component, you can fetch its own data. And the good thing about that is if you're fetching the same thing, so if you have two components and they're fetching the same thing, that fetch will actually be deduplicated. So it would be cached and used as a one fetch. So it will only use one fetch to get data for both of those components. So this is a good optimization, and why the React Server components are fast. Also, the increased performance is thanks to the usually your server is somewhere closer to the data centers than the actual user on their client on the phone or something like that. So server is usually closer to data centers. It has a low latency, and it can easily fetch. You can easily call the database and have these database calls. And yeah, as I said, it has a built-in deduplication, which increases the performance even more. It also solves the problem of multi-page applications where we have a state loss between navigation, because we still do have a client navigation that's happening on the client after everything is rendered. The client takes over, so it can. An important thing that I talk about is server sending a JSON to the client and not HTML. So why it's sending a JSON? Well, because we want to have still have React reconciliation working, which is basically like seeing the difference between the current virtual DOM and what changed. And so in this way, React reconciliation still works because we're sending a JSON of JSX, and it can go to the JSX and diff the current virtual DOM with it, and only change things that have been changed, and so preserve any state that was in the component. So that's a really good one. So we didn't lose that, even though if we have server routing, we didn't lose like the state between navigation. It can be used as a full stack application. So if you don't have a backend, or you want to create a backend and you don't know what to use, well, you can use now React Server Components, because you have your access to your DB directly in the components. And yeah, important thing also about the sizes, it reduces the bundle sizes, because if you open your app in the sources tab, you'll see only the client components. So it will only download the client components. So the client does not know about the server components, and that reduces the bundle sizes by a lot. Like I know someone said it reduced, maybe for them it reduced around 60% of the bundle size, which is a lot. So the main thing about server components is like a new way of thinking, and also the increased performance that we get, and the safety of a server, that, and also maybe access to your files. Like on the browser, you don't have access to files. On the server, you could access your files in the components, which is great. And yeah, we have a hybrid between multi-page application and single-page application, and we also still have everything good that we had about server-side rendering. So we really have kind of everything there. So what is bad about it? Well, there's a few things. First, all code written for the server must be serializable, and that basically means translates into we can have handlers or state in the server, because they need to be serializable. The second thing is the dev experience. I think anyone that tries to work with the server components the first time will be confused, because you will get a lot of errors, and there's introduced complexity about thinking, okay, what are the server components, what are my client components, stuff like authentication, for example. You need to have different, like, how do you fetch a user on the client, how do you fetch a user on the server, so you need to think about that. And there's a steep learning curve with it, but I think once you get hang of it, then you'll be good. So what can happen in that case is overuse of use client. Basically, people that are not familiar with React Server Components, they would just put use client everywhere, and then the server components lose their meaning. So yeah, it requires a new mental model when approaching the development, because as I said, you need to know how to split your components differently, and you need to decide what will be server, what will be client. And I think this will take time for this intuition to for you to get this intuition, like where do I put the servers, where do I put the client. And one more thing that I think is really important is issue with third-party libraries. So if third-party libraries use anything on the client that requires maybe browser APIs or local storage or anything like context, it would not work on the server. So that can be an issue. It can also be an issue if components use server only, or the libraries use server only, and then you want but you want to run it on client. So you have to wrap your component into you have to wrap the library in your component that says use client in order to use it on the client. So I think there will be some issues with the libraries. For example, there's issue with Chakra UI that really does not support anything on the server right now, so you can't use it. And there will be a lot of more libraries like that. Yeah, and some important limitations. You cannot import a server component in your client component. So you can do something like that, like import example server component and then try to render it out in the client component. And now you're thinking, well, I said that you can have server at every level of DOM, right? Well, you can, but you just can't like import it directly. You would have to pass it through children or to a prop. So you can imagine if this example client component, if the children are server components, then that would work. So you still can have this, but you cannot do it like this implicitly. So this is important thing to know because when I first started working with it, I tried this and I wasn't sure like why it's not working. Right. So yeah, some more few things about the limitations is the access to browser APIs. So as I said, local storage, session storage window, you don't have that on the server. Also global contexts. So a lot of apps would try and have providers at the root of the app, and because server does not know about React context, you cannot have providers at the root level. I mean, you can use client and say like, okay, but then the server components lose the meaning. So you really need to think about this stuff, like where do I put the context, where do I put the providers, how do I handle, for example, if you're saying your JVT token in local storage, how do I now get that from on the server if I need it, and stuff like that. And it also does not support WebSockets because it runs only once on the server, and that's it. So it does not support WebSocket. It would require some client-side pooling for you to do that. All right, so getting started. So what I would advise if you're interested in this topic and you want to try it out, I recommend you try Next.js app directory. You can also try it. You can also fork the official React repo, but that like requires a lot of knowledge to get started. So React is not yet like it does not have the documentation ready or anything. So I think Next.js, if you want to try it, is the best a best place to get started. So if you talk about adoption, I think people will slowly start integrating React server components if needed. And the good way to go about it is to have, for example, in the beginning, have only 2 server components and everything else to be client, and then incrementally add those server components in to kind of have the same split, maybe 50-50 or even more server components than client components. One thing to note when starting is you should not feel bad about using client components because they're like, it's not that we're saying like, oh, okay, now all the client components are bad. No, you can still use them. You can use them everywhere, wherever you want. It's just that it would be good if you can things that can be run only on the server and don't require any interactivity or client. It would be best if they're server components. So I think that's important. Yeah, when you try to look up server components, and you will have basically an infinite amount of blogs and videos, and so I think it's easy to learn on your own. And yeah, expect to get a lot of errors in the beginning because, as I said, you'll need to have this mental model first before getting the hang of it. And these are some, I think, good. These are some maybe good references. Understanding React Server Components by Vercel, I think that will help you a lot. You also have for the Free Code Camp a good blog. Tez Kumar on YouTube had a good video about this, and you can also follow Dan Abramov, which he's like from the React team, and he likes to explain it. So that will be a good starting point. And so looking ahead, it's still not production ready. So React does not have a documentation ready, and they're not quite sure how the whole feature will look like. So they know the goal. The goal is to incorporate React Server components and like have them be the default, but they're not sure how to get there yet. So we'll have to see and wait what happens. And we'll have to wait and see if they're the standard way of building user interface in the future, or if we'll be back to the client only. And there's one more thing that I want to mention is server actions, which I haven't talked about yet, but they're the important topic. So they're still in alpha, but you can use them in Next. So they're usable in Next. And what they basically do is they allow you to pass a functions from the server to the client. So you could technically send a handlers from the server to the client, but they will need to be server only, so they can't access window or anything like that. And it kind of works like a RPC, like remote call procedure. You know, you get the function on the client, and then you call it directly. You call the server directly. So that I think that will be really interesting. So when they get stable and they became the standard way of things, I think it will improve the server components by a lot. That's it. Thank you for listening. I hope it was I hope you learned something. As I said, it's surface level, so I just wanted to introduce you to it. But if you want to go deeper, I suggest that you go to the blogs and the YouTube videos, which really go in depth of how they're used. And of course, you can try them yourself. I think that will be the best. So yeah, that's for the presentation. Now we can have, so if you have any questions, we can address them now in the comment section. So let me see if there's anything. Do you have experience with server components and GraphQL API? So no, I haven't tried API GraphQL API yet. I think it's really interesting. It's an interesting combination to try. But you can, I think, I'm not sure if you can use the things like an Apollo client and stuff like that on the server. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's a good thing to try out maybe. Thanks for the presentation. It was helpful to get the idea. Still don't work with RC. Thank you. Let's see if there's any other questions. So yeah, I think the best way to go about it is to basically start on your own, and then when you try it out yourself, I think it will be a lot easier when you see it yourself how it works. So nice presentation. Good job. Thank you. Let's see. All right. If there are no other questions, as I said, please follow us on Instagram. We'll have more talks like this for the FrontSpot Balkans. We'll have more interesting talks in the future. We already have some planned out, so I think it'll be great if you follow it. There's a lot of things to learn. Yeah, thank you for listening. Okay, I think that will be it.